There was empires in Africa called Kush, Timbuktu, where every race came to get books. My success to you, even if you wish me the opposite. Sooner or later, we'll all see who the prophet is.
So I am the Kutik Minister. This is GKTV, and let us begin. Esfa, welcome to GKTV.
Thank you.
Okay,
it's good to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to definitely have you up here. Before we even started, we saw footage on TV where you took to task explaining reparations to people who do not care about reparations. And tell the truth, can't even see why we should have it. Some of them in skin what doesn't look like ours, obvious. Some of them in skin what looks like ours, not so obvious, but these mentalities remain. Reparations. What does it mean? And the reason I ask that of you is, if someone came to me personally and said, well, what do you think of reparations? There's a part of me which says, oh, this demon, he's not going to give us nothing. It's just not in his nature. He knows exactly who and what we are as a people. And though he gave to the Jews, that's like giving his brother, sorry, I've been a naughty brother, I took all your stuff, here you can have some back. And you know, the way the Jews have infiltrated their society, because they can, because they're the same people, they've been able to create that environment. Whereas, and then we look at other groups of people like the Japanese, but the Japanese had a culture still intact. You know, even though they had 2 nuclear bombs dropped on them and decimated thousands and thousands of lives, the point is their culture, which had gone back thousands of years, remained intact. Whereas with us as a people, through that which we've been through, the colonisation, not just the past 400 years, but we was already divided way before that into various different tribes, some by way of infiltration, some by having to go and hide and change who we were to protect and keep our sacred records. So, and those records linking back to our divinity of who and what we are, and the European understanding that during his countless incursions into us as a people, and recognizes who we are as a divine people, recognizing that we're the only people who have the ability to put this wicked devil type person underfoot. Why would he ever give us reparations? That's one aspect of how I would perceive things. We'll explore this. But the second thing, which I've learned by talking to people from within the reparations movement, which opened up my eyes to a totally different perception of reparations, is the galvanizing of our people, the education of our people on the journey to begin waking up and find something to stand under and unify us, not individual small groups what unify, stand under these little small things which they grab hold of, but I'm talking about something which has affects all of our lives, which you're going to explain as we find out more about reparations. And in that aspect, it gave me a totally different insight. So I'm kind of torn, but I understand why it's necessary. So with the reparations movement, what does reparations actually mean?
Very good question to begin with, because the term reparations is probably one of the most misrepresented and misunderstood terms. It simply means to repair harm and damage. The earliest usage of the term in English, I think, go back to 1300s or so, the late 1300s, and it's always related to, repairing harm, repairing damage, making repairs, coming from reparare, to repair. Essentially, however, though, the term in recent years has almost become synonymous with payment of compensation. And herein lies the problem, in that compensation is only one aspect of how you repair harm. Yes? Reparations, the term, we use a definition that has been advanced by somebody called Professor Chinwezu, who is a Nigerian public intellectual, and he advanced this definition at the first conference on reparations for slavery, colonization and neo-colonization in Abuja 1993. And I'm going to paraphrase the definition. In fact, no, I'm not going to paraphrase because I've actually got the definition here. And I think it's really important to read it out. Reparation is not just about money. It is not even mostly about money. In fact, money is not even 1% of what reparation is about. Reparation is mostly about making repairs. Self-made repairs on ourselves, mental repairs, psychological repairs, cultural repairs, organizational repairs, social repairs, institutional repairs, technological repairs, economic repairs, political repairs, educational repairs, repairs of every type that we need in order to recreate and sustain viable black societies. He goes on to state, more important than any monies to be received and more fundamental than any lands to be recovered is the opportunity the Reparations campaign offers us for the rehabilitation of black people, by black people, for black people. Opportunities for the rehabilitation of our minds, our material condition, our collective reputation, our cultures, our memories, our self-respect, our religious and political traditions, and our family institutions. But first and foremost, for the rehabilitation of our minds. He says, the most important part of the reparation campaign is our self-repair, the change it will bring about in our understanding of our history, of ourselves, and of our destiny, the change it will bring about in our place in the world. So this is the conceptual definition that we use, which is a holistic, multi-layered definition around repairing damage. We as a people cannot be totally whole when we have gone through, as you have quite rightly stated, thousands of years of what is now commonly called the Maangamizi, which is a Kiswahili term meaning African Holocaust of chattel, colonial and neo-colonial forms of enslavement. So everything around us has been affected because our enslavement and the degradation and dehumanization of our people impacted the whole planet, not just us. The world was turned around as a result of our fall. Yeah, and we've not ever fully risen back up as yet. And so, yes, we do need this big picture thinking, but conceptual definitions are sometimes difficult to operationalize. And so we also recognize within the international social movement for African reparations, something called the operational framework of the United Nations principles and guidelines on a right to a remedy and reparation for violations of human rights law, serious violations of human rights law and international humanitarian law. And according to these principles, which were sort of formalized properly around 2005, there are 5 key aspects to holistic reparations, which any reparations for any group who's gone through any form of historical and continuing injustice require.
Okay, as you go through this particular 5, if you give the 1, we'll talk about that.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. So the first one is restitution. Really important, because to provide restitution or to effect or secure restitution is to put a people or a group back in the position they would have been in, we would have been in, had we not been enslaved, and in fact, had we not, lost our sovereignty and everything like that, restitution. And it can include measures like the right to return to one's homeland, rematriation. People might commonly hear the term repatriation, but if we recognise that our homeland is the Mother Earth, we rematriate, yes? The right to citizenship and to exercise that citizenship wherever we are on the planet. So we may not have to physically live on our mother continent in order to be able to have a say in the current dispossession of our continent in terms of our resources, especially with the role of multinationals who will continue to extract wealth from under the feet of our family members on the continent. But we also have a say because those resources are also ours. Yes?
So, okay. And I like that word restitution. The reason I really like the word restitution is within our Kanisa, within our church, out of the 9 principles that we have, the first principle is, when someone embraces the truth as we teach it. But then the second part of that, once embracing, is restitution, or the rights of restitution.
Okay.
And the reason we have that right is because it's very important, as you say, for deeds to be balanced out. That is the principle, one of the foundations of us as a people, the laws of matter. Okay?
Absolutely.
And the laws of matter is that balancement. And I think it just goes back to the original point when I mentioned, part of me, there's a part of me which looks at reparations and thinks, well, we'll never get it off of this person, because on one scale you have us, Nubian Mennonites, African peoples, and on the other side you have those Europeans, and they just don't seem to have the nature to want to balance. They're not like, well, we'll come in your land and live harmlessly with you. We'll come in your land, and we just can't help it by nature. We steal everything. And in that theft, you spoke about the multinationals. Their role behind, because when you're dealing with the United Nations, where do you see the multinationals? How do you perceive these big corporations who, in essence, run governments?
Absolutely.
How do you then get them? Because where the governments may have a moral obligation by way of the laws that they implement to the people, because I know you was very active in embarrassing, I think, was it the Labour government? Or bringing to highlight their hypocrisy.
Absolutely.
And because they have a moral judgment, they're saying one thing as politicians, and then obviously not carrying it out. So therefore you can embarrass them. But the powers behind them, such as the multinationals, who only think about the almighty dollar, the pound, the finance, the wealth, how do you get them to perceive restitution, or do you feel they don't really have a play once you're dealing with United Nations?
Oh no, they do. I mean, with these are UN principles. It's not to say that the UN's going to do anything, because these principles have come about through struggle, not because heads of government decided, one day we're going to do the right thing. People have always used the UN as a platform. Certainly, colonized peoples and peoples from Africa, especially, have used that as a platform to kind of force through our agendas and to try and speak to the international community to try and transform hearts and minds. Because yes, you will always get a section of people that no matter what they hear, they're not going to change. But then there are others that something comes up in them in terms of, well, we do say we are this, and we've got to honour that which we preach. Yes? And so alliance building and the lobbying and the kind of politics that goes on at the UN is how those principles have come about. But in relation to your specific question around the roles of multinationals, it's very difficult to hold multinationals to account. I mean, we've got the example of Shell in the Niger Delta, who have, they're supposed to do a cleanup in the Niger Delta, because that is supposed to be the most polluted place on the planet. And it has been so difficult to get them to be accountable. However, what you see are always coalitions of the willing. The people who are most affected, who do all kinds of things. And let's not forget, in the Niger Delta, there was armed struggle recently, kidnapping, officials who worked for these oil companies as a way of highlighting their cause and trying to sort of build pressure so that people could do the right thing. So there are all kinds of strategies and tactics that are being deployed by those most affected and many of their allies and other similar movements in solidarity. Okay. The reality, however, of these multinationals is that the peoples who are affected are forming bonds and alliances even across ethnicities. So some of these corporations are not just impacting us in Africa. Right. They're going to India, they're doing the same thing. And the movements of resistance, social movements, I'm a great advocate of and believer in social movements because I believe that it's people that bring about change. People.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, and you know, I asked the question because you know the key thing we must get across to the listeners, and it was just summed up just then. The people. You are the people. You're the people listening. You're the people watching these things, and you know the solidarity what you're seeing, not just amongst African peoples, but even Europeans and peoples, by way of turning their arms up against governments.
Yes.
I mean, look at Greece.
Absolutely.
Just recently. So we're seeing that movement where people are saying no. You know, no more, and you're starting to see that solidarity coming together. So you know, restitution, the balancement comes in on those scales by way of the people on one side, which are the majority, and the minority, which is the rulership on the other side. So effectively, we're supposed to, by way of all the math and things balancing out, we're supposed to, because you can't have that many on that side and that little bit holding it balanced. It has to.
Definitely,
shift.
And we must remember that our people are not just in Africa. Let's look at the Americas, where you have over maybe 250 to 300 million people of African descent. They officially go by this label of Afro-descendant. So the social movements in the Americas, especially South America, are very strong. They are changing governments, and they are forcing through recognition of our own indigenous cultural cosmovisions. So in 2010 in Bolivia, the plurinational state of Bolivia, for instance, they enacted something called the Laws of Mother Earth, which was going back to indigenous peoples or original peoples' way of life, which wasn't about capitalism and commodification and buying up everything and making everything into a commodity. It was about, we are a people, we relate harmoniously with other peoples, we relate harmoniously with our earth. The health of the earth is indicative of the health of the people. And we're seeing African people in that region also begin to assert ancient African philosophical and ethical ideals and principles around how we as human beings, the true human beings, are supposed to live amongst each other, but also recognizing that we are not an island by ourselves. We have to find harmonious ways of living with others. But it also requires power to be able to do that.
Okay, so that's the step, restitution. Okay, I don't think we'll take so long on the other steps. We'll be here till the morning. It's kind of hot up in the studio.
Yes.
But okay, so that's one. You said out of the 5 points, 1 point being restitution.
Okay, so then let's look at compensation now. Compensation, most people will be familiar with, is
show me the money.
Yeah, money. But it's not just about money, actually. Compensation is putting a financial value on violations, crimes, harm, the damage, and the legacies of that damage. So if we look at the Niger Delta, what is the financial cost of environmental cleanup? And they've actually said it would take over 30 years in order to clean up that piece of land. It would also include things like the amount of resources that have been unjustly extracted from Africa. What's something called in law unjust enrichment. So the unjust enrichment to the West. So the fact that the West thinks it's great and is actually sitting on and using resources that were extracted from our mother continent and the labour of our peoples, as well as the earth, you know, what has been taken from the earth, and then the value that they have placed on it, is part of, if we were to be able to put a financial price on that, that could be something that could you know, fall into a compensation package. Also the loss of trade. So Europe has been forcing something called economic partnership agreements on our countries, which is a big area of where the economic enslavement is happening. So we are not producing for ourselves, we're not, you know, growing food, and we're importing all these nutricidal, toxic chemicals and foods that are giving us all these sicknesses. So the value of that and the cost of that is something that could come into compensation. But it's really how we put a financial price on harm, and that could be psychological harm, mental harm, economic harm, physical, direct harm, etc., and violence.
So with compensation, we'd have to recognise we'd never really get what is compensated. I don't think there's enough resources left on the planet to compensate us for what has been done. But even if we was to get 1% of that which is owed to us, another thing with compensation, when you're dealing with people will often say, well, if we was compensated tomorrow, who's going to get the money? Yeah. Because black folk, you know, Nike would be happy. Yeah. The local chicken shops would be happy.
Absolutely. The hair shops. The hair shops
would be happy. Yeah, so we'd get that compensation, and most of it would go then back to the same enslavers to continue enslaving us because of where the mind is at mentally amongst us, the people. But, you know, with that compensation, I suppose that is the part what most people look at when they think about reparations.
Probably.
But it does.
Probably a lot of people maybe initially start there.
But you've made it quite clear, but it is not.
It's a lot bigger than that. It's not just about compensation. And there have been various attempts, and they're still ongoing, to quantify a figure, a sum. But I'm not necessarily somebody that's not the area that I work on. And it's important work, and it must be done. But there's also, I think we need a revolution of values around how we address and redress repair, in the sense of we have to go back to, as the Chinwezu definition spoke about, the repair of our mind. And so originally, is that how we governed ourselves? It wasn't about putting a price on everything.
Exactly that. I often say this, you know, GKTV is a great advocate of black group economics, very much for that. I personally understand economics to be a very important aspect of what we do as a people, but I often say, is black group economics really just white group economics with black faces?
Right, absolutely.
Is this what it really becomes? Because if we put a value on it, but then that's easy to say when you don't have none of the resources.
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
know, once you've got the resources, then you can say, well, let's put it all down and do things a different way. But when you don't, but at the same time, do we then emulate how Europeans have done things where it becomes about the money? I've got this, because we've got to recognise that the financial system we have today, he could say it's quantified to be trillions upon trillions, and then crash the system tomorrow and say it's not really worth nothing.
Well, I'm glad you've said that. Really important. That thinking is there within the movement. The movement's not homogenous. There are different tendencies, and for some people, all they're interested in is quantum compensation. But others of us actually give that kind of analysis. We only need to look at what happened with Zimbabwe, you know, when they left the Commonwealth, and how that economy was literally crashed.
That's right.
Yeah. Now, some of the elevated thinking that has come out of our minds, especially people in the African diaspora, in the Caribbean, this call in the 1970s and 80s, push actually amongst particular nations in the South for a new international economic order. And it's something that the Manley government was also involved with and was heavily penalised for. Because you are right, we cannot truly have economic repairs in a system that is continuing to enslave and despoil. We need a new system, and the Occupy movement was all about that, And we don't take up, we're not organising outside of geopolitics. This is a geopolitically aware movement and struggle, very internationalist, and we're not so naive as to think that what has happened to other people, and especially the treatment that's happening in Greece, would not happen to us. So that's why we need different thinking. We need a paradigm shift. even in terms of what we consider to be economics, what we consider to be wealth. And the beautiful thing about this movement is that we have those people who are working on those strategies, but change is not going to happen overnight. It's taken a long time for us to get into this mess. We are not going to get out of this mess in a generation. And it's important, therefore, for us always to sankofa, to look back in order to move forward. Let's look back at our ancestral journey and what we've tried and what we've tested, because we've had hundreds of years of applied reparations in terms of all of our efforts thus far to rehabilitate ourselves, to restore ourselves, Palmares, the Haitian Revolution. These were reparatory justice struggles, and there's a lot of learning that we have to do.
Fight the system and its ways, don't be afraid. Just be the change. And with all this people power, we'll use peace for power. Hey.